in the quiet shadows of a forgotten town, where the air hums with the weight of unspoken dreams, a boy's life begins to unfold. Welcome to the story of Severus Snape, a journey woven with longing and loss, a tale to cradle you gently into sleep. Let the gray streets of Spinner's End draw you in, their stillness a soft invitation to rest. A childhood in shadows. In the gray, unyielding streets of a forgotten town, a boy was born into a world that seemed to have no place for him. Severus Snape came into existence in the shadow of a looming mill, its chimneys belching smoke into a sky that rarely cleared. The air was thick with the scent of coal and damp earth, a heavy blanket that pressed down on the narrow rows of houses lining Spinner's End. His earliest memories were not of laughter or warmth, but of the low hum of machinery in the distance, a sound that seeped into the walls of his home and into his bones. The world outside was cold, indifferent, and the world within was little different. His mother, Eileen, was a thin figure with hollow eyes, her once sharp mind dulled by years of disappointment. She moved through the house like a ghost, her hands trembling as she stirred pots or mended clothes that were already threadbare. There was a time, perhaps, when she had dreamed of something more, of a life woven with magic and wonder. But those dreams had long since faded, leaving only a quiet resignation. Severus watched her, his dark eyes wide and searching, as if he could find in her silence some answer to the ache that gnawed at him. But she rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped, tinged with a bitterness he couldn't yet name. His father, Tobias, was a different kind of shadow, a man whose presence filled the small house with tension rather than comfort. His voice was rough, like the gravel that crunched underfoot in the alleyways, and his hands were calloused from labor at the mill. Tobias had no patience for the strange, quiet boy who clung to his mother's skirts, nor for the oddities that seemed to follow him. A vase that shattered without being touched, a flicker of light where no candle burned. These were things that Tobias met with shouts and suspicion, his anger a storm that Severus learned to weather in silence. The boy grew accustomed to the sound of raised voices, the clatter of a chair overturned, the heavy tread of boots retreating into the night. And in the stillness that followed, he would sit alone, tracing patterns in the dust, waiting for something he couldn't define. The house itself was a cage of peeling paint and sagging beams, its windows smudged with grime that let in only a weak gray light. The floors creaked underfoot, and the air carried the faint, sour smell of damp wood and neglect. Severus spent hours in the corners of those rooms, his small frame curled into itself, his mind a refuge from the world beyond. He found solace in the few books his mother kept hidden, tattered volumes of spells and potions, their pages yellowed and curling. She had been a witch, he knew, though he never spoke of it now. Those books were a thread to something greater, a whisper of a life where he might belong. He traced the words with his fingers, sounding them out in a hushed voice, letting the strange syllables roll over his tongue like a secret only he could keep. The streets of Spinner's End offered no reprieve. The other children, with their ruddy cheeks and careless laughter, moved in packs, their games loud and rough. Severus watched them from a distance, his lank hair falling into his eyes, his clothes too large and patched at the seams. He was a shadow among them, a boy who didn't fit, whose stillness marked him as other. They called him names, Snivelus, they'd jeer, their voices sharp as stones, and he learned to shrink further into himself, to let the words glance off him like rain on a window pane. But they lingered, those taunts, settling into the quiet places of his mind, where they echoed long after the voices had faded. And yet, there were moments, brief, fleeting glimpses of something softer. A river ran near the town, its waters slow and dark, reflecting the sky in muted shades of gray and blue. Severus would sit by its banks, the damp grass cool beneath him, and watch the current carry leaves and twigs downstream. The sound of the water was steady, a low murmur that drowned out the noise of the world. He would close his eyes and imagine himself drifting with it, carried far from the smoke and the shouting, to a place where the air was clean and the shadows were kind. It was there, in those quiet hours, that he first felt the stir of something within him, a spark, a hum, a power he couldn't name but knew was his own. Spinner's End, a home without warmth. The years crept by in that crumbling house, each one blending into the next, a slow march of gray days and restless nights. Severus grew taller, though never broader, his frame thin and angular, his face sharp with hunger and something deeper, an ache that no meal could fill. The walls of Spinner's End seemed to close in tighter with each passing season, the air growing heavier with unspoken words. His mother's hands shook more often now, her eyes darting to the door whenever Tobias was near. His father's temper grew shorter, his absences longer, and Severus learned to move through the house like a wisp of smoke, unseen and unheard. There was no hearth to gather around, no stories told in the flicker of firelight. The evenings were spent in silence, the three of them orbiting one another like planets too far apart to touch. Eileen would sit with her mending, her needle moving in slow, deliberate stitches, while Tobias slumped in a chair, a bottle in hand, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the walls. Severus would retreat to his corner, a book balanced on his knees, the words a lifeline to a world where he wasn't powerless. The pages spoke of magic, real magic, not the tricks of charlatans or the tales of fools. They spoke of wands and incantations, of a school called Hogwarts where those like his mother belonged. He clung to those stories, turning them over in his mind until they felt as real as the cold floor beneath him. Sometimes, when Tobias was gone and the house was still, Eileen would sit beside him. Her voice was soft then, barely above a whisper, as she told him of the life she'd once known. She spoke of a castle with towers that pierced the sky, of halls filled with the hum of magic, of a time when she had been more than a shadow. Severus listened, his breath catching in his chest, his eyes bright with a hunger he couldn't hide. She taught him small things, a charm to mend a tear, a potion to ease a bruise, and he soaked it in, his hands steady where hers trembled. Those moments were rare, fragile as glass, and they always ended too soon. The door would creak, the boots would thud, and the silence would return, thicker than before. The town beyond the house offered little more. The mill loomed over everything, its shadow stretching across the streets like a hand that wouldn't let go. The air was thick with soot, the sound of machinery a constant drone that followed Severus wherever he went. He wandered those streets alone, his steps quick and quiet, his head bowed against the wind. The other children had grown bolder in their cruelty, their laughter sharper, their games more pointed. He avoided them when he could, slipping down alleys and along the river's edge. But they found him still. A shove, a trip, a stone flung from a distance. These were the rhythms of his days, and he met them with a clenched jaw and eyes that burned. But there was one place where the world softened, if only slightly. Beyond the rows of houses, past the mill's dark bulk, lay a patch of scrubland where the river bent and widened. It was there that he first saw her, a girl with hair like fire and eyes that held the green of summer leaves. Lily Evans. She was everything he was not, bright, alive, untouched by the shadows that clung to him. He watched her from the tall grass, his breath shallow as she laughed with her sister, her voice carrying over the water like a song. She was magic. He knew it, even before he saw the flower bloom in her hand, or the sparks that danced at her fingertips. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a longing so deep it felt like pain, a need to be near her, to be seen by her, to belong to the world she carried so effortlessly. The first glimpse of magic. The discovery of Lily changed everything, though the change was slow, a quiet unfolding beneath the surface of his days. Severus returned to the river again and again, drawn by the pull of her presence, his steps lighter despite the weight he carried. He watched her from the shadows at first, too afraid to step into the light, too certain she would turn away. But she didn't. One day her eyes found his, and she smiled, a small, curious smile that pierced the armor he'd built around himself. He stepped forward, hesitant, his voice rough from disuse, and told her what he knew, that she was a witch, that he was a wizard, that there was a place for them beyond the gray streets of their world. She listened, her head tilted, her laughter soft as she asked him questions he was eager to answer. He told her of Hogwarts, of the spells he'd read about, of the life that waited for them. His words tumbled out, clumsy but earnest, and she met them with a warmth he'd never known. They sat by the river for hours, the water murmuring beside them, the air thick with the scent of mud and wildflowers. Severus felt the world shift beneath him, the edges of his loneliness softening, if only for a moment. Lily was a light he hadn't dared to hope for, and he clung to her presence like a drowning man to a rope. Their meetings became a rhythm, a secret woven into the fabric of his days. They would sit in the grass, her voice bright as she spoke of her family, her dreams, her small joys, and he would listen, storing each word like a treasure. He taught her what he knew, simple charms, the names of potions, the history of the wizarding world, and she learned quickly, her magic as natural as breathing. Severus marveled at her, at the ease with which she bent the world to her will, and he felt his own power stir in response. Together they made sparks dance in the air, turned stones to feathers, called flowers from the earth. It was a quiet magic, a gentle magic, and it filled the empty spaces within him. But the world beyond their riverbank was not so kind. Lily's sister, Petunia, watched them with narrowed eyes, her voice sharp with disdain. She called him a freak, a beggar, her words cutting deeper than the stones of the Spinner's End boys. Severus flinched but held his ground, his gaze steady on Lily, who frowned and told her sister to stop. Petunia would storm off, her footsteps loud against the earth, and Lily would turn to him with an apology in her eyes. He shook his head, telling her it didn't matter, though it did. It always did. But with Lily beside him, the sting was less, the shadows lighter, and he let himself believe that this friendship, this magic, could be enough. At home, the air grew heavier still. Tobias's rages came more often, his voice a thunder that shook the walls, and Eileen's silence deepened, her hands stilling over her work. Severus hid his magic from them, burying the books beneath his bed, whispering spells only when he was alone. But the power within him grew, restless and insistent, spilling out in small, uncontrollable bursts, a cracked window pane, a flame that flared too high. Tobias noticed, his eyes narrowing, his shouts turning to accusations. Eileen said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor, and Severus felt the walls of Spinner's End press closer, the cage tightening around him. The river and Lily became his only escape, the only place where the world felt wide enough to hold him. Hogwarts. A new world, a new isolation. The letter came on a gray morning, its wax seal gleaming against the worn envelope. Severus tore it open with trembling hands, the words blurring before his eyes. Asterisk Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry asterisk. It was real then. The castle, the magic, the promise of a life beyond the mill's shadow. He ran to the river, the letter clutched tight, and found Lily waiting, her own envelope in hand. Her smile was a mirror of his own, bright and unguarded, and they sat together, reading the words aloud, their voices weaving a dream into the air. September couldn't come fast enough, and the days that followed were a haze of anticipation, the gray of Spinner's End fading beneath the weight of what lay ahead. The journey to Hogwarts was a blur of steam and chatter, the train's whistle a call that echoed in his chest. Severus sat with Lily, the compartment a small world of their own, her laughter filling the space as she pressed her nose to the window. He watched her, his hands folded in his lap, the patched robes he wore suddenly too heavy. The other children glanced at him, their eyes lingering on his thin frame, his sallow skin, but Lily didn't notice or didn't care. She talked of the houses, the lessons, the wonders they'd find, and he nodded, letting her voice wash over him, a tide that carried him forward. The castle rose before them as the boats glided across the lake, its towers piercing the night sky, its windows aglow with a light that felt alive. Severus stared, his breath catching, the sight a balm to the years of gray. The great hall was vast, its ceiling a swirl of stars, its tables alive with voices. He stood with the others, his name called in a voice that echoed, and stepped forward, the sorting hat slipping over his eyes. It whispered in his mind, sifting through his thoughts, his hunger for power, his need to prove himself, his quiet, desperate hope. And then it spoke. Asterisk Slytherin asterisk. The word rang out, and he moved to the table where green and silver waited, his steps steady, though his heart raced. Lily's turn came moments later, her name a soft sound in the hall's clamor. The hat paused, then called asterisk Gryffindor asterisk, and Severus felt something twist within him. She smiled at him from across the room, her eyes bright, but the distance between their tables felt wider than the lake they'd crossed. The Slytherins around him were a mix of sharp smiles and cool glances, their voices low as they sized him up. He sat among them, his head bowed, the chatter a hum he couldn't join. The castle was vast, its halls endless, but the isolation he'd carried from Spinner's End followed him still, a shadow no magic could banish. The sorting, a choice that echoes. The days at Hogwarts stretched into weeks, the castle a labyrinth of stone and secrets. Severus moved through it with quiet purpose, his robes brushing the floor, his eyes tracing the walls as if they might reveal something more. The lessons were a revelation, potions with its simmering cauldrons, the scent of herbs and smoke filling the air, defense against the dark arts with its whispered spells and shadowed corners. He excelled, his hands steady over the mortar, his voice soft but sure as he answered questions others stumbled over. The professors noticed. their nods a small warmth in the cold expanse of his days. But it wasn't enough to bridge the gap between him and the world around him. Slytherin was a house of ambition, of pride, and Severus found a place among its edges. The older students spoke of power, of bloodlines, of a world where magic ruled and weakness was scorned. He listened, his silence a shield, his mind turning their words over like stones. They saw his skill, his sharpness, and some drew him in, their voices smooth as they spoke of the dark arts, of spells that went beyond the classroom. Severus felt a pull toward it, a hunger that had grown in the shadows of Spinner's End, fed by the books he'd pored over in secret. It was a path, a purpose, and he let it take root, its tendrils curling into the quiet places of his heart. Lily was a constant, a thread that held him to something softer. They met in the corridors, the library, the courtyards, her presence a light that cut through the castle's gloom. She spoke of her classes, her friends, her wonder at the magic around them, and he listened, his responses careful, his eyes fixed on her. But there were others now, Gryffindors with loud voices and easy laughter, boys like James Potter and Sirius Black, whose confidence filled the air like a storm. Severus watched them from a distance, their taunts a familiar sting, their eyes lingering on him with something like disdain. Lily laughed with them, her head thrown back, and he felt the twist again, sharper now, a fear he couldn't name. The sorting had set them on different paths, though he hadn't seen it then. Slytherin and Gryffindor were worlds apart, their tables divided by more than wood and space. Severus felt the pull of his house, its promises whispering in his ears, while Lily drifted toward hers, her light untouched by the shadows he carried. He told himself it didn't matter, that their riverbank days would hold them together. But the castle was vast, and the distance grew with each passing day. He walked its halls alone, his steps echoing, the weight of his choice a quiet ache that followed him into the night. Potions and dark arts, a growing fascination. The dungeons became his refuge, their chill a comfort against the clamor of the castle above. The potions classroom was a world of its own, its walls lined with jars of strange ingredients, its air thick with the scent of simmering brews. Severus sat at the back, his cauldron before him, his hands moving with a precision that felt like instinct. The professor, Slughorn, praised him, his voice booming with approval, but Severus barely heard it. The potions were what mattered, the way they bubbled and shifted, the power they held in their depths. He lost himself in them, the world fading to the rhythm of his stirring, the soft hiss of steam a lullaby that eased the ache within him. He scribbled in the margins of his book, his quill scratching out notes, adjustments, refinements, spells of his own making. The textbook was a starting point, but he pushed beyond it, his mind racing with possibilities. A drop more of this, a whisper of that, and the potion would bend to his will, its effects sharper, stronger. He tested them in secret, late at night when the dungeon was empty, the flicker of torchlight his only companion. The results were his triumph, a quiet proof of the power he craved, and he hoarded them like treasures, their secrets his alone. The dark arts called to him too, their pull stronger in the shadowed corners of Slytherin. The older students spoke of them in hushed tones, their eyes gleaming as they shared books and scrolls forbidden by the school. Severus listened, his curiosity a flame that grew with each word. He borrowed what he could, reading by wandlight in the dormitory, the pages crackling under his fingers. The spells were complex, dangerous, their power a hum that vibrated in his chest. He practiced them in whispers, his wand trembling, the air around him thickening with something he couldn't name. It was a thrill, a release, a way to carve his place in a world that seemed determined to overlook him. Lily noticed, though he tried to hide it. She asked him once, her voice soft, her brow creased with worry, what he was reading, why his eyes were so shadowed. He brushed her off, his words sharp, and she frowned, her silence heavy between them. He hated the look in her eyes, the questions she didn't ask, but he couldn't stop. The dark arts were a path, a strength, a shield against the laughter that followed him, the taunts that echoed in the halls. James Potter and his friends were louder now, their pranks bolder, their voices a constant hum of mockery. Severus felt their eyes on him, their wands flicking in his direction, and he turned to the shadows, letting them wrap around him like a cloak. The potions and the dark arts wove together in his mind, a tapestry of power and control. He dreamed of a day when he wouldn't be the boy in patched robes, the one they laughed at, the one who watched from afar. He dreamed of a world where his name meant something, where his skill was a weapon no one could ignore. The dungeons were his sanctuary, their darkness a mirror to the growing shadows within him, and he sank into them, the castle fading to a distant hum as he chased the secrets that lay beyond the light. The boy who watched from afar. The seasons turned, the castle's stones growing colder as autumn bled into winter. Severus moved through the days like a ghost, his presence a whisper in the halls. He sat in classes, his quill scratching, his answers sharp when called upon. But he kept to himself, his eyes fixed on the pages before him. The Slytherins accepted him, some with nods, others with sly smiles, but he didn't seek their friendship. He had Lily, or so he told himself, though her time was split now, her laughter shared with others whose voices grated against his ears. He watched her from a distance, his place by her side less certain with each passing week. She walked with Gryffindors, their red and gold a stark contrast to his green and silver, their confidence a wall he couldn't breach. James Potter was the loudest, his hair a mess, his grin wide as he tossed a snitch in the air. Sirius Black was beside him, his laughter sharp, his eyes glinting with mischief. They moved through the castle like they owned it, their pranks leaving chaos in their wake. And Severus felt their gaze settle on him more often now, their words a blade he couldn't dodge. It started small, a trip in the corridor, a flick of a wand that sent his books sprawling. He gathered them in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes burning as their laughter followed him. Lily was there sometimes, her voice sharp as she told them to stop, but they didn't listen, and she didn't push. Severus hated that most of all, the way she stood between them, her frown soft, her eyes sliding away from his. He wanted her to choose, to see him as he saw her, but she didn't, and the distance grew, a chasm he couldn't cross. He retreated further, his world narrowing to the dungeons and the riverbank memories he clung to. The dark arts filled the empty spaces, their power a comfort against the sting of her absence, the weight of their taunts. He practiced late into the night, his wand steady, his voice a whisper as he shaped spells that thrummed with intent. The potions grew darker too, their ingredients rarer, their effects sharper, and he hid them beneath his bed, their vials a secret he guarded with care. The castle was vast, its halls endless, but it felt smaller with each passing day. Severus walked its corridors alone, his steps echoing, his shadow long against the stone. He watched Lily from afar, her light a beacon he couldn't reach, and he felt the pull of the shadows deepen, their promise a balm to the ache within him. The boy from Spinner's End was still there, beneath the robes and the spells, a boy who longed for more than the world would give him. And as the winter winds howled outside, he turned inward, letting the darkness take root, its tendrils curling toward the years that lay ahead. Shadows of Hogwarts. The castle loomed against the twilight sky, its ancient towers stretching upward like fingers brushing the clouds. For Severus Snape, Hogwarts was a world apart from the grime of Spinner's End, a place where magic thrummed in the stones and secrets hid in every shadowed corner. His first year had slipped by in a haze of lessons and solitude, but as the second year dawned, the castle began to feel less like a dream and more like a crucible. The Sorting Hat had placed him in Slytherin, a house draped in green and silver, where ambition was king and power was the prize. Yet, with that promise came a creeping isolation, a chill that echoed the damp dungeons where he now carved out his days. Severus drifted through the corridors with a quiet grace, his black robes trailing softly behind him. The castle's endless hallways were lined with portraits, their painted gazes tracking his steps, though he rarely met their eyes. His head stayed low, his dark hair falling like a curtain over his face, a shield against the stares of others. The Slytherin common room welcomed him each night, a cavern beneath the Black Lake, where the water pressed against the windows, casting a faint, shimmering glow across the stone walls. It was a place of whispered plans and sly glances, where older students spoke of magic beyond the textbooks, of spells that carried weight and consequence. Severus lingered in the corners, his ears attuned to their hushed voices, his mind eager to drink in every word. Those older Slytherins painted a world where power was everything, where the dark arts weren't just forbidden, but revered. They spoke of books tucked away in the restricted section, of curses that could command respect, of a strength that could silence mockery. Severus felt the pull of it, a quiet hunger born in the shadows of his childhood. He wanted to rise above the boy in tattered robes, the one whose name drew snickers in the halls. The dark arts beckoned like a promise, and he followed, his steps leading him to the library when the castle slept. The restricted section was a realm of dust and stillness, its shelves heavy with the scent of aged parchment and something sharper, something that lingered in the air like a secret waiting to be claimed. Madame Pince patrolled with hawk-like precision, her footsteps a warning, but Severus had learned to move unseen. He slipped between the shelves, his breath shallow, his fingers brushing the cracked spines of forbidden books. When he found one, he'd carry it back to the dormitory, reading by the dim light of his wand. The words were old, the ink faded, but they pulsed with life. Spells that could bind, hexes that could sting, curses that whispered of control. His wand trembled as he practiced, his voice barely a murmur, but the magic answered, curling through him like a thread of shadow. For the first time he felt it, power, his to wield. Yet Hogwarts wasn't all shadow. There was light too, and it came in the form of Lily Evans. She remained his anchor, a tether to the boy he'd been by the riverbank, though the space between them grew with every passing day. They'd meet in quiet places, the library's tucked-away tables, the courtyard's stone benches, where her voice would fill the silence with stories of her classes and her Gryffindor friends. Her hair caught the sunlight, red as autumn leaves, and her laughter was a sound Severus hoarded like a treasure. He listened, his replies measured, his eyes tracing her face. She was warmth where he was cold, brightness where he was dim, and he clung to her presence even as he felt it slipping. Lily's world was expanding, pulling her toward others. She'd found friends in Gryffindor, girls who giggled over charms and boys who strode through the castle with effortless confidence. Among them were James Potter and Sirius Black, their names inescapable, their voices loud enough to echo off the stone walls. They were the Marauders, a pack of troublemakers who turned the corridors into their playground. Their pranks were relentless, their laughter sharp, and Severus became their favorite target. A flick of their wands sent his books tumbling, his robes twisting around his legs, their taunts cutting deeper than he'd admit. He'd gather his things in silence, his face a mask, his heart a tangle of fury and shame. Sometimes Lily was there, her voice rising in his defense, sharp and clear. "Leave him alone," she'd snap. But James would grin, Sirius would shrug, and the moment would pass. She never pushed harder, and Severus hated the flicker of pity in her eyes when she looked at him. He wanted her to choose him, to stand by him fully, but she didn't. And the sting of it drove him deeper into the shadows. The dungeons became his refuge, the dark arts his solace, their promise drowning out the ache that gnawed at him. The potions classroom offered another kind of escape. Its air was thick with the scent of simmering cauldrons, the faint hum of magic woven into every bubble and swirl. Professor Slughorn, with his booming voice and penchant for favorites, singled Severus out, praising his precision, his knack for turning recipes into art. But Severus barely registered the words. The potions themselves held his focus, the way they shifted from murky to clear, their colors deepening with a careful stir or a measured drop. He filled the margins of his textbook with notes, his quill scratching out tweaks and inventions, each one a quiet triumph. The results were his alone, a proof of skill he kept close, a shield against the world outside. The dark arts grew within him, filling the spaces where loneliness had taken root. Late at night, when the dormitory was still, he'd sit by his bed, wand in hand, whispering incantations until the air thrummed with intent. The magic felt alive, a partner to his will, and he welcomed it, letting its tendrils wind through him. The castle's shadows stretched longer as the seasons turned, their embrace a comfort against the wounds he couldn't name. Winter settled over Hogwarts, snow blanketing the grounds in a hush that mirrored the quiet within him. He moved through the days like a wraith, his presence soft, his thoughts turned inward. Lily remained a constant, though her time with him dwindled. Her laughter now belonged to others, to James, to Sirius, to a world that felt further from Severus with every step. The Marauders' taunts grew bolder, their wands quicker, and Severus retreated further, his books and spells his only companions. The potions classroom stayed his haven, the dark arts his strength, and the castle's endless corridors his quiet domain. The light of the riverbank faded, a memory buried beneath the weight of the shadows he now called home. And so, the years at Hogwarts unfolded, each day a thread in the tapestry of Severus Snape's life, a life woven with longing, bitterness, and the slow, steady pull of the darkness he would one day embrace. This narrative continues the story with a gentle rhythm, inviting you to drift into its depths as Severus navigates the complexities of Hogwarts, his heart torn between light and shadow. The rift and the fall. The years at Hogwarts slipped by like pages in a book, each one turning with a quiet inevitability. Severus Snape moved through them with a stillness that belied the storm beneath his skin. The castle's corridors stretched longer, their shadows deeper, as he carved a path between the light of his longing and the dark of his ambition. The sorting had set him on a course that diverged from Lily Evans, though he clung to the hope that their riverbank days could anchor them still. But hope is a fragile thing, and the rift between them widened with each passing season, its edges sharp with unspoken words and choices made in silence. Lily's laughter now belonged to others, Gryffindors with loud voices and easy smiles, their confidence a wall Severus couldn't breach. She walked with them through the sunlit courtyards, her red hair catching the light, her presence a beacon he watched from afar. He'd find her in the library sometimes, her head bent over a book, and they'd sit together, the air thick with the scent of parchment and ink. But her words were fewer now, her gaze drifting to the window, and Severus felt the distance grow, a chasm he couldn't cross. The marauders circled her like wolves, their leader James Potter tossing a snitch in the air, his grin wide as he called her name. Severus's hands tightened on his quill, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing, letting the silence speak for him. The taunts grew sharper, the marauders' pranks a constant hum in his days. They'd wait for him in the halls, their wands quick to trip or hex, their laughter a blade that cut deeper with each pass. Severus learned to walk with his head down, his steps quick, but they found him still. A flick of Sirius Black's wand sent his books sprawling. A whisper from Peter Pettigrew brought snickers from the shadows. He'd gather his things in silence, his face a mask, but inside, the anger simmered, a slow boil that fed the darkness within him. The dark arts became his refuge, their power a balm to the wounds he couldn't heal. Late at night, in the Slytherin dormitory, he'd practice the spells he found, his voice a whisper, his wand steady. The magic answered, curling through him like a promise, and he welcomed it, letting its tendrils take root. Lily saw the change, though she didn't understand it. She'd ask him, her voice soft, why he spent so much time with the older Slytherins, why his eyes were shadowed with secrets. He'd deflect, his words sharp, and she'd frown, her silence heavy between them. The rift grew, a crack that widened with each choice he made, each step he took toward the shadows. He wanted to tell her, to make her see, but the words stuck in his throat, tangled with pride and fear. And so, he watched her drift further, her light slipping through his fingers like water. The potions classroom remained his sanctuary, its air thick with the scent of simmering cauldrons and crushed herbs. Professor Slughorn's praise was a distant hum, his booming voice lost to the rhythm of Severus's work. The potions were his art, each one a masterpiece of precision, their colors shifting from murky to clear with a careful stir. He filled the margins of his textbook with notes, his quill scratching out innovations that even Slughorn hadn't seen. The results were his quiet triumph, a proof of skill he hoarded like a dragon with its gold. But it wasn't enough to fill the hollow spaces within him, the ache that grew with each day. The marauder's cruelty reached its peak in the spring of his 5th year, the air warm with the scent of blooming flowers. Severus sat beneath a tree by the lake, his potions book open on his lap, when their shadows fell over him. James's voice was loud, his wand flicking lazily as he called out, "Hey, Snivelus!" The hex caught Severus mid-step, lifting him into the air, his robes tangling, his wand slipping from his grasp. The laughter rang out, sharp and cruel, as Sirius egged James on, his grin wide. Severus's face burned, his voice choked as he spat curses that only drew more jeers. And then Lily was there, her voice cutting through the noise, her eyes flashing as she told James to stop. For a moment, the world held its breath, Severus hung suspended, his pride in shreds, his heart pounding with rage and shame. James lowered him, his smirk fading, but Severus's voice broke the silence, a word slipping from his lips like poison. Mudblood. The air stilled, the laughter died, and Lily's face went pale, her eyes wide with hurt. She turned and walked away, her steps quick, her shoulders stiff, and Severus felt something shatter within him. The marauders' taunts faded, their victory hollow, but the damage was done. The rift became a chasm, its depths dark and unbridgeable. The days that followed were a blur of regret and fury. Severus sought Lily out, his voice pleading, but she shook her head, her eyes hard. "You've chosen your path, Severus," she said, her words a blade that cut deeper than any hex. He watched her walk away, her red hair a flicker in the distance, and the shadows closed in, their embrace cold and final. The dark arts became his solace, their power a shield against the pain he couldn't voice. He turned to them fully, letting their tendrils wrap around him, their promise drowning out the ache. The castle's corridors grew colder as winter settled in, snow blanketing the grounds in a hush. Severus moved through the days like a wraith, his presence a whisper in the halls. The potions classroom stayed his refuge, the dark arts his companion, the castle's quiet corners his home. Lily's light was gone, a memory buried beneath the choices he'd made, and he let the shadows take root, their darkness a comfort as the world slipped into night. And so, Severus Snape's years at Hogwarts drew to a close, each one a step further into the shadows he would one day call his own. The castle held him close, its stones a witness to his silent fall, as the night deepened and the world beyond faded into sleep. This ends The Rift and the Fall asterisk, a chapter in Severus Snape's story that traces his quiet descent amid loss and longing. Let its gentle rhythm carry you toward rest as the castle's shadows fade into the stillness of night. A growing fascination. The dungeons of Hogwarts stretched beneath the castle like the roots of an ancient tree, their cool, shadowed corridors winding deep into the earth. For Severus Snape, they had always been a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world above faded into a distant hum. But as his 5th year slipped into his 6th, those stone walls began to transform, becoming more than a refuge. They became a crucible, a space where his fascination with the dark arts took root and flourished. The air down there was heavy with the scent of damp stone and the faint tang of potions brewing, and it was in this stillness that Severus found himself drawn to something deeper, something forbidden. He spent countless hours in the library's restricted section, his footsteps soft against the worn wooden floors, his thin fingers brushing the spines of books that seemed to pulse with secrets. The titles alone were a siren's call, curses and counter-curses asterisk, the rise and fall of the dark arts, asterisk, magic mosta evil, each one promising knowledge that went beyond the mundane spells taught in classrooms. He'd slip them beneath his robes, their weight a quiet comfort, as he returned to the Slytherin common room. There, bathed in the eerie green light filtering through the lake's surface, he'd sit by the window, the pages open before him, his wand flickering as he whispered incantations into the night. The spells were intricate, their effects both beautiful and dangerous, and Severus felt them awaken something within him, a sense of power, of mastery, that he'd craved since his earliest days in Spinner's End. Alone in the dormitory, he'd stand before the cracked mirror, his reflection pale and sharp-edged, and murmur the words until they flowed like a river. The air would hum, the shadows stretching and curling as if alive, and for a fleeting moment, the boy in the glass looked stronger, his eyes darker, his presence undeniable. It was a quiet thrill, this taste of control, and he savored it, letting it fill the empty spaces where loneliness had settled. His talent didn't go unnoticed. The older Slytherins, once aloof figures who barely spared him a glance, began to take interest. Lucius Malfoy, with his silver hair and cool, measured voice, would watch as Severus demonstrated a particularly clever hex, his nod of approval a rare prize. Avery and Mulciber, their laughter rough and jagged, would share their own findings, their voices hushed as they spoke of magic that could twist fate itself. They gathered in the common room late at night, the fire casting long shadows across the stone, and Severus sat among them, his silence a shield for the thoughts that churned within. He wasn't sure he shared their grand ideals, their talk of a world remade, but the camaraderie, the sense of belonging, was a salve to the wounds left by his fractured past. Yet, even as he drifted deeper into their orbit, a part of him lingered in the light. He'd see her sometimes, Lily, her red hair catching the torchlight in the corridors, her voice a soft echo as she laughed with friends he didn't know. She no longer looked for him, her eyes passing over him as if he were a ghost, but he couldn't stop himself from watching. The memory of that day by the lake lingered like a bruise, the word he'd flung at her, mudblood, a wound that festered. He'd tried to take it back, standing before her with his voice breaking, but she'd turned away, her words cutting deeper than any spell. "You've chosen your path, Severus," she'd said, and the finality of it had settled into his bones. The potions classroom remained his anchor, its familiar rhythms a thread tying him to something steady. The scent of crushed herbs and simmering cauldrons wrapped around him like a cloak, and Professor Slughorn's praise was a constant refrain. "A natural, my boy, a natural," he'd boom, holding up a vial of Severus's work, perhaps a flawless draft of living death, its surface shimmering like liquid night. Severus would nod, a faint smile tugging at his lips, but the warmth of it faded quickly. Once Lily's voice would have joined Slughorn's, her teasing words a counterpoint to his gruff pride. But now the room felt emptier, the silence heavier. The Marauders' taunts had lessened since that day by the lake, their pranks growing sporadic, their eyes wary when they crossed his path. It might have been a victory, but it tasted like ash. Severus walked the halls alone, his head high, his robes billowing slightly with each step. But inside, he was a tangle of regret and resolve. The dark arts became his solace, their power a balm to the ache that never quite faded. He'd slip into abandoned classrooms, the air thick with dust and stillness, and let the magic pour from him. Hexes that sparked like lightning, curses that whispered of shadow. Each spell was a step further from the boy he'd been, and he took it willingly, the rush of it drowning out the echoes of what he'd lost. The circle tightens. The Slytherin common room was a world unto itself, its walls carved from the living rock of the castle, its windows offering glimpses of the lake's depths. Fish drifted past in lazy schools, their scales glinting in the dim light, and the fire burned low, casting a warm glow over the gathered students. It was here in the quiet hours that Severus found himself drawn into the fold of the older Slytherins. Lucius Malfoy sat at the center, his presence commanding even in stillness, his words weaving a tapestry of ambition and promise. "The Dark Lord is rising," Lucius said one night, his voice smooth as polished stone. "He seeks those with talent, those who see the world as it could be." The firelight danced in his pale eyes, and Severus listened, his gaze fixed on the flames. Voldemort, the name was rarely spoken, a whisper on the edge of fear, was a figure shrouded in rumor, a wizard whose power was said to rival even Dumbledore's. The older students spoke of him with a mix of awe and hunger, their voices low as they described a future where pure magic reigned, where those like them would stand above the rest. Severus didn't respond, but the words lingered, sinking into the cracks of his mind. He'd always been an outsider, his half-blood heritage a quiet shame in a house that prized lineage, his poverty a mark he couldn't erase. The dark arts had given him strength, a way to carve out a place for himself. But Lucius's words offered something more, a purpose, a path beyond the gray streets of Spinner's End. He turned them over in his thoughts, testing their weight, and found they fit too well into the hollows of his ambitions. His days took on a new rhythm. By morning, he moved through classes with mechanical precision, his quill scratching notes in margins already filled with his own inventions, spells and potions born of restless nights. By afternoon, he'd retreat to the dungeons, his cauldron simmering as he refined his craft under Slughorn's approving eye. But it was the nights that belonged to the dark arts, to the quiet gatherings where Avery and Mulciber tested curses on conjured targets, where Lucius spoke of meetings beyond the castle walls. Severus joined them, his wand steady, his contributions earning murmurs of respect. The castle itself seemed to shift with the seasons, its halls growing colder as autumn faded into winter. Snow fell in soft drifts outside, blanketing the grounds in a hush that mirrored the stillness within him. He'd walk the corridors alone, his breath visible in the chill air, his thoughts a whirl of shadow and light. Lily's presence was a constant ache, her laughter drifting from the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall, her figure a fleeting glimpse as she hurried to class. He told himself he didn't care, that she'd made her choice. But the lie was thin, and it unraveled each time he saw her. The potions classroom remained his refuge, its stone walls a barrier against the chaos of his mind. Slughorn's voice filled the space, warm and jovial, as he praised Severus's latest brew, a Veritaserum so clear it looked like liquid glass. "Magnificent, my boy," he'd exclaim, clapping Severus on the shoulder. The praise was a fleeting comfort, a reminder of the talent that set him apart. But it couldn't bridge the gap where friendship had once stood. He worked alone now, his movements precise, his focus absolute, and the solitude suited him, or so he told himself. The dark arts grew stronger within him, their pull a tide he no longer resisted. He'd practice in the dead of night, his wand tracing patterns of light that faded into shadow, the spells flowing with a grace that felt almost natural. The magic was a rush, a current that swept away the doubts, and he let it carry him further from the boy who'd once dreamed by the river with Lily. The older Slytherins noticed, their approval a quiet thread weaving him into their tapestry, and Severus stepped closer, his place among them solidifying with each spell he mastered. The choice. It was in his 7th year that the path became clear, though it arrived cloaked in shadow. The common room was quiet that night, the fire reduced to embers, the lake's glow a faint shimmer through the glass. Lucius sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, and spoke of Dark Lord's call. "He seeks those with skill, Severus," he said, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of inevitability. "Those who understand the true nature of magic. You could be among them." The words hung in the air, a promise laced with something darker, and Severus felt them settle into him like stones in a riverbed. He'd spent years in the margins, his name a murmur, his presence a flicker in the eyes of others. The dark arts had given him power, a shield against the world that had rejected him. But this was a chance to rise, to be seen. He thought of Spinner's End, its gray streets stretching endlessly before him, a cage he'd sworn to escape. He thought of Lily, her back turned, her light fading from his life. And he thought of the magic that thrummed in his veins, the strength he'd cultivated in the shadows. He didn't answer Lucius that night, but the decision was already taking shape, a quiet resolve hardening within him. The world beyond Hogwarts loomed, its edges uncertain, its promises fragile. He could return to Spinner's End, let the grayness swallow him whole, or he could step into the unknown, into a future where his talents might mean something more. The dark arts were a comfort, their power a steady pulse, but they demanded a price, a slow unraveling of the boy he'd been, the one who'd once believed in a life woven with light. The seasons turned, winter deepening its hold on the castle. Snow piled high against the walls, the wind howling softly through the turrets, and Severus moved through the days like a wraith, his presence a whisper in the halls. The marauders kept their distance, their pranks a rare interruption, their eyes cautious when they met his. He felt no triumph in it, only a hollow quiet. Lily was a ghost in his periphery, her red hair a flash of color he couldn't ignore, her silence a weight he carried with every step. The potions classroom remained his sanctuary, its rhythms a balm to the storm within. Slughorn's praise was a steady drumbeat, his voice filling the dungeon as he marveled at Severus's work. "Exceptional, truly exceptional," he'd say, holding up a vial of shimmering liquid, its clarity a testament to Severus's skill. The words were a fleeting warmth, a reminder of what he could do, but they couldn't fill the spaces where Lily's voice had once been. He brewed alone, his hands steady, his mind a whirl of shadow and resolve. The dark arts were his companion now, their power a thread he followed deeper into the night. He'd stand in empty rooms, his wand carving arcs of light that faded into darkness, the spells a dance of control and chaos. The magic was a thrill, a rush that drowned out the ache, and he chased it, letting it pull him further from the boy he'd been. The older Slytherins were his tether, their nods a silent affirmation, and Severus stepped fully into their circle, his place among them sealed with each hex he perfected. Into the shadows. The end of his 7th year came quietly, the castle's halls emptying as students prepared to leave its walls behind. The great hall buzzed with farewells, the air thick with anticipation, but Severus felt only the weight of what lay ahead. Lucius had made the arrangements, his voice calm as he spoke of a meeting, a moment where Severus would stand before the Dark Lord and pledge his loyalty. The words were a current pulling him forward, and he let them carry him, his heart heavy but his resolve firm. The night he left Hogwarts, the sky was clear, the stars a scattering of light above the forbidden forest. He stood on the grounds, his robes catching the breeze, and looked back at the castle one last time. Its towers rose against the darkness, their outlines familiar yet distant, a place that had shaped him and broken him in equal measure. He thought of Lily, somewhere within those walls, her life moving forward without him. He thought of the boy he'd been, the one who'd sat by the river and dreamed of magic. That boy was gone, his shadow fading with each step Severus took into the night. The meeting was held in a place far from Hogwarts, a manor hidden in the folds of the countryside. its walls steeped in old magic. The air was thick with incense, the shadows deep and restless, and Severus stood among others, figures cloaked in black, their faces hidden, their wands at their sides. Lucius was there, his presence a steady anchor, and when the Dark Lord appeared, the room seemed to shift, the air growing colder, heavier. Voldemort was a figure of quiet menace, his voice a hiss that coiled around the mind, his eyes red and piercing. He spoke of power, of a world remade, and Severus listened, his head bowed, his heart pounding. When it was his turn, he stepped forward, his wand raised in allegiance, and felt the weight of the choice settle into him. The dark mark burned into his forearm, a sharp pain that faded into a dull ache, and he knew there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of shadow and purpose. He returned to Spinner's End briefly, the house as gray and lifeless as he remembered. But it was no longer his prison. The Dark Lord's cause became his own, its demands a rhythm he learned to follow. He brewed potions for the Death Eaters, his skill a quiet asset, and cast spells that carried the weight of darkness. The magic was a thrill, a power he wielded with precision, but it came with a cost, a slow erosion of the light he'd once held, a fading of the dreams he'd shared with Lily. Yet, even in the shadows, her memory lingered. He'd hear whispers of her sometimes, fragments carried on the wind, her name tied to James Potter, to a life he couldn't touch. The pain of it was a quiet thing, a thread woven into the fabric of his days, and he buried it beneath the magic, beneath the purpose that drove him forward. The boy from Spinner's End was gone, replaced by a man cloaked in darkness, his path set, his heart a tangle of regret and resolve. The nights were long in those early days, the sky a canopy of stars or a shroud of cloud, and Severus moved through them like a shadow among shadows. The manor became a familiar place, its halls echoing with the voices of those who'd chosen the same path. Lucius guided him, his words a steady hand, and Severus followed, his wand a tool of power, his mind a labyrinth of secrets. The dark arts were his strength, their pull a tide he no longer fought, and he let them shape him, let them carry him into the darkness he'd chosen. And so, the descent was complete, not with a crash, but with a quiet step, a turning away from the light. The castle faded into memory, its towers a silhouette against the past, and Severus Snape became something new, something forged in shadow. The world stretched before him, uncertain and vast, and he walked into it, his heart heavy, his steps sure, the echoes of what might have been fading into the night. A life in service, the shadowed brotherhood. The world beyond Hogwarts unfolded like a tapestry of shadow and smoke, its threads woven with the quiet menace of the Dark Lord's rising power. Severus Snape stepped into it with a stillness that masked the storm within, his black robes blending into the night as he joined the ranks of the Death Eaters. The manor where he'd sworn his allegiance became a familiar haunt, its high ceilings and dark corridors echoing with the murmur of cloaked figures. The air carried the faint scent of incense and old stone, a heavy stillness that settled over him like a cloak. This was his new reality, a life carved from the ambitions he'd nurtured in the dungeons of Hogwarts. Yet it felt less like triumph, and more like a weight he couldn't name. The Death Eaters were a brotherhood bound by shadow, their faces hidden beneath masks of silver and bone, their voices a chorus of whispers and commands. Lucius Malfoy stood among them, his presence a steady anchor, his words smooth as he guided Severus through the early days. The dark mark on his forearm was a constant reminder, a dull ache that flared with each summons, its serpentine lines a brand he bore in silence. The meetings were a ritual of sorts, held in candlelit rooms where the air thrummed with magic, where Voldemort's voice slithered through the darkness like a river of ice. He spoke of a world remade, of purity restored, and Severus listened, his head bowed, his heart a tangle of resolve and unease. His talents found purpose here. The potions he'd perfected in the Hogwarts dungeons became tools of the cause. Elixirs to strengthen, poisons to silence, brews that shimmered with a quiet menace. He worked in makeshift laboratories, the scent of simmering cauldrons a comfort amid the chaos, his hands steady as he measured and stirred. The Death Eaters praised his skill, their nods a rare currency, and Severus took it, letting it fill the hollow spaces where pride might have lived. The dark arts, too, were his domain, spells cast with a flick of his wand, their power a rush that coursed through him like a tide. He stood among the masked figures, his voice low, his magic sharp, and felt the weight of their respect settle over him. Yet, the nights were long and restless. Spinner's End became his retreat between summons, its gray walls a stark contrast to the manor's grandeur. The house was unchanged, peeling paint, creaking floors, the faint echo of his father's shouts lingering in the air. He'd sit by the window, the river a dark ribbon beyond the glass, and let his thoughts drift. The Dark Lord's promises were grand, his vision a fire that burned through the wizarding world, but Severus felt no warmth in it. The missions grew darker, raids on quiet villages, whispers of disappearances, the soft cries of those caught in the crossfire, and he carried them like stones in his chest, their weight a quiet burden. Lily lingered in the corners of his mind, a memory he couldn't bury. He'd hear fragments of her life through the Death Eaters' network, her name tied to James Potter now, their union a whisper on the wind. The pain was a dull ache, a thread woven into his days, and he pushed it down, letting the potions and spells drown it out. The riverbank was a distant dream, its laughter faded, and he told himself it didn't matter. He'd chosen this path, stepped into the shadows, and there was no turning back. The seasons turned, the world outside growing colder as the Dark Lord's shadow stretched further. Severus moved through it all with a quiet grace, his presence a flicker among the masked figures, his heart a labyrinth of shadow and regret. The manor's halls were his stage, the potions his art, the dark arts his shield, and yet beneath it all, a question lingered, soft and persistent, like the wind through the trees. The prophecy heard. The night was heavy with rain, its patter a soft rhythm against the manor's windows, when the words came that would shift the course of Severus's life. He stood in the shadows of a dimly lit room, his cloak damp from the storm, his breath shallow as he listened to the Dark Lord's voice. Voldemort spoke of a prophecy, a fragment overheard by one of his followers, a seer's vision of a child born at the end of July, a child who could bring his downfall. The air grew colder, the Death Eater's murmurs a low hum, and Severus felt the words settle into him like a stone sinking into the lake. He didn't know then what it meant. Not fully. The prophecy was a riddle, its edges vague, but Voldemort's eyes gleamed with a quiet fury as he vowed to find the child, to end the threat before it could grow. Severus nodded with the others, his face a mask, but his mind raced. He thought of Lily, of the life she'd built beyond his reach, and a flicker of unease stirred within him. The Dark Lord dismissed them, his voice a hiss that lingered in the air, and Severus stepped into the night, the rain washing over him as he apparated away. Spinner's End welcomed him with its familiar silence, the river a dark mirror beyond the window. He sat in the dim light, his wand resting on the table, and let the prophecy turn over in his thoughts. A child born at the end of July. There were many, surely, but the unease grew, a quiet whisper that refused to fade. He'd heard of Lily's marriage to James, of their defiance against Voldemort's cause, and the pieces began to align, their edges sharp with a fear he couldn't name. The Dark Lord would hunt them, he realized, and Lily would be in his path. The thought was a jolt, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. He pushed it away, telling himself it was nothing, that she'd made her choice, that he owed her nothing. But the riverbank rose in his memory, her laughter, her green eyes, the way she'd looked at him as if he mattered. And the ache returned, sharper now, a wound that wouldn't heal. He stood, pacing the small room, his steps soft against the creaking floor, and felt the shadows shift within him. The dark arts were his strength, the Death Eaters his place, but this was something he couldn't bury. Days turned to weeks, the prophecy a quiet hum in the background of his life. He carried out his duties, brewing potions, casting spells, standing among the masked figures. But the unease grew, a tide that pulled at him. He'd see Lucius's sharp smile, hear Avery's rough laughter, and wonder what they'd say if they knew the thoughts that churned beneath his silence. The Dark Lord's plans took shape, his focus narrowing to two families, the Potters and the Longbottoms. And Severus felt the net tighten, his heart a tangle of shadow and light. The turning point. It was a night in late autumn, the air crisp and still, when Severus made his choice. He'd heard whispers of a raid, a plan to strike at the Potters, and the fear he'd pushed down rose like a wave, crashing over him. He stood by the river at Spinner's End, its waters dark and slow, and saw Lily's face in the ripples, her smile, her voice, the life she'd built without him. The Dark Lord would take it all, he knew, and the thought was a blade he couldn't dodge. He'd chosen the shadows, embraced their power, but this was a cost he couldn't bear. He apparated to Hogsmeade under cover of darkness, the village quiet beneath a blanket of frost. The path to Hogwarts was familiar, its twists and turns etched into his memory, and he moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The castle rose before him, its towers a silhouette against the starry sky, and he slipped through the gates, his breath visible in the chill air. Dumbledore waited at the edge of the forbidden forest, his blue eyes piercing even in the dim light, his presence a quiet strength that steadied the night. Severus spoke quickly, his voice low and urgent, the prophecy spilling from him like water from a broken dam. "He thinks it's her son," he said, his hands trembling despite the stillness he forced into his frame. "He'll kill her, Lily. Please, you have to protect her." Dumbledore watched him, his gaze steady, and Severus felt the weight of his own words, the desperation that laced them. He'd come as a supplicant, a traitor to the cause he'd sworn to serve, and the shame of it mingled with the fear that drove him. Dumbledore's voice was soft, a murmur that carried the weight of understanding. "And what do you offer in return, Severus?" he asked, his eyes searching. Severus swallowed, his throat tight, and made the vow that would bind him. "Anything," he said, the word a whisper, a promise forged in the shadow of his regret. Dumbledore nodded, his silence a pact sealed, and Severus felt the world shift beneath him, a turning away from the darkness, a step toward something new. The meeting was brief, the night swallowing them both as Severus returned to Spinner's End. He sat by the window, the river a quiet companion, and let the choice settle into him. He'd served Dumbledore, a double agent in a war that stretched before him, all to keep Lily safe. The dark mark burned faintly on his arm, a reminder of the path he'd walked, but the ache for her was stronger, a thread that pulled him back from the abyss. A life divided. The months that followed were a quiet unraveling, a life split between shadow and light. Severus returned to the Death Eaters, his mask in place, his voice steady as he carried out their bidding. He brewed potions in hidden rooms, their steam rising like ghosts, and cast spells that echoed with the power he'd honed. Lucius and the others saw no change, their trust unshaken, and Severus let them believe, his silence a shield for the truth he carried. But his nights belonged to Dumbledore, to whispered meetings on windswept hills or in the quiet of Hogwarts grounds. He'd report what he knew, the Dark Lord's plans, the movements of his followers, his words clipped, his eyes averted. Dumbledore listened, his presence a steady anchor, and Severus felt the weight of his service grow, a burden he bore in silence. The castle was a distant memory now, its halls a place he could no longer call home, but it loomed in his thoughts, a symbol of what he'd lost and what he fought to protect. Lily remained beyond his reach, her life a quiet hum he couldn't touch. He'd hear of her through Dumbledore, her son Harry, born at Summer's End, her defiance against the Dark Lord's shadow. The knowledge was a comfort and a pain, a reminder of the riverbank days and the chasm that lay between them. He buried it beneath his work, letting the potions and spells fill the silence, their rhythm a steady pulse that carried him forward. The war deepened, its echoes reaching even the gray streets of Spinner's End. Severus moved through it with a quiet grace, his presence a flicker among the shadows, his heart a tangle of duty and longing. The dark mark was a constant, its burn a thread tying him to the past, but the vow to Dumbledore was stronger, a lifeline he clung to as the world slipped into night. And so, Severus Snape's life took on a new shape, a life in service, divided between the darkness he'd embraced and the light he'd sworn to shield. The river flowed on beyond his window, its waters a mirror to the years ahead, and he walked into them, his steps soft, his resolve a quiet flame burning in the shadows. The mask of loyalty, a double life. The wizarding world teetered on the edge of shadow, its nights growing longer as Voldemort's power swelled. Severus Snape stood at its heart, a figure cloaked in black, his life a delicate thread woven between two masters. The dark mark on his forearm burned faintly, a tether to the Death Eaters he served, while his vow to Dumbledore held him to a quieter, more perilous path. The air carried the scent of rain and ash, a reminder of the war that crept closer with each passing day, and Severus moved through it with a stillness that masked the storm within. Spinner's End remained his retreat, its gray walls a haven between the chaos of his divided existence. The house was unchanged, its floors creaking softly, its windows streaked with grime, but it felt smaller now, a cage he'd outgrown yet couldn't escape. He'd sit by the river, its dark waters flowing steadily beyond the glass, and let the silence settle over him. The Death Eaters summoned him often, their meetings held in shadowed manors or hidden hollows, the air thick with the hum of dark magic. Lucius Malfoy's voice was a constant, smooth and commanding, as he spoke of raids and plans, his trust in Severus unshaken. Severus nodded, his face a mask, his words measured. and carried their secrets back to Dumbledore. Those meetings with Dumbledore were a lifeline, held in quiet places, the edge of the Forbidden Forest, a windswept hill under a starless sky. The old wizard's presence was a steady anchor, his blue eyes piercing through the dark, and Severus would recount what he'd learned. The Dark Lord's movements, the names of those targeted, the whispers of a strike growing near. His voice was low, his hands steady despite the tremble he buried deep, and Dumbledore listened, his silence a weight that pressed against Severus's resolve. "You do this for her," Dumbledore would say, his words soft, and Severus would nod, the ache for Lily a quiet flame that never dimmed. The potions he brewed for the Death Eaters were his shield, their shimmering vials a proof of loyalty that kept suspicion at bay. He worked in hidden rooms, the scent of herbs and steam a comfort amid the tension, his hands moving with a precision honed over years. The dark arts remained his strength, their power a rush he wielded with care. Spells cast in shadowed corners, their echoes a reminder of the path he'd walked. The Death Eaters saw only the mask, the cold efficiency he wore like armor, and Severus let them, his true allegiance buried beneath layers of shadow. The war crept closer, its echoes reaching even the gray streets of Spinner's End. Whispers of battles, of villages burned, of families torn apart, drifted through the air, and Severus carried them like stones in his chest. He'd see Lily's name in his mind, her life with James and their son a quiet hum he couldn't touch, and the fear that drove him to Dumbledore grew sharper. The Dark Lord's focus had narrowed, the prophecy a blade aimed at the Potters, and Severus felt the net tighten, his heart a tangle of duty and dread. The night of betrayal. The end came swiftly, a storm breaking over a world already fractured. It was a night in late October, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, when the summons came. A sharp burn on his forearm, a call he couldn't ignore. Severus apparated to the manor, its halls colder than ever. The Death Eaters gathered in a circle of flickering torchlight. Voldemort stood at the center, his voice a hiss that coiled around the mind, his red eyes gleaming with triumph. "The Potters are found," he said, and Severus felt the words strike like a hex, his breath catching in his chest. He stood among the masked figures, his face a mask of stone, but inside panic clawed at him. Dumbledore had promised protection, a Fidelius charm, a secret keeper to shield them, but something had gone wrong, the plan unraveling in a way Severus couldn't grasp. Voldemort spoke of Godric's Hollow, of a traitor named Pettigrew, and Severus understood, too late, that the net had closed. He nodded with the others, his voice steady as he offered a potion for the task, but his mind raced, searching for a way to warn, to stop what was coming. He apparated to Dumbledore the moment he could, the night swallowing him as he landed on a hill overlooking Hogwarts. The castle glowed faintly in the distance, its towers a silhouette against the sky, and Dumbledore met him there, his robes billowing in the wind. "He knows," Severus said, his voice breaking, the desperation spilling out. "He's going tonight, Lily." Dumbledore's face was grave, his silence a weight, and Severus felt the world tilt beneath him. "We've done all we can," Dumbledore murmured, but the words were hollow, a whisper against the storm. The hours that followed were a blur of shadow and rain. Severus returned to Spinner's End, pacing the small room, his wand clutched tight as he waited for news. The river flowed on, its waters a dark mirror to his thoughts, and he saw Lily's face in every ripple, her laughter, her eyes, the life he'd sworn to protect. When the news came, a whisper through the Death Eater's network, a tale of a house in ruins, of Voldemort's fall. It was a blow he couldn't dodge. Lily was gone, her light extinguished, and Severus sank to the floor, the silence of the house pressing against him like a shroud. He apparated to Godric's Hollow in the dead of night, the village quiet beneath a sky streaked with stars. The house was a shell, its walls charred, its roof collapsed, and Severus stepped through the wreckage, his breath shallow. He found her in the nursery, her body still, her red hair spilling across the floor like a flame snuffed out. Harry lay in the crib, a scar on his forehead, his cries a soft echo in the stillness. Severus knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her face, the grief a tide that swept him under. He stayed there until dawn, the world fading to a hum, his heart a tangle of loss and rage. The mask forged anew. The days that followed were a haze of shadow and silence. Voldemort was gone, his power shattered by the child he'd sought to kill, and the Death Eaters scattered, their masks discarded in fear. Severus returned to Dumbledore, his voice hollow as he spoke of the end, of Lily's death, of the boy who lived. "You promised," he said. The words a whisper, a wound laid bare, and Dumbledore's eyes softened. His silence a weight Severus couldn't bear. "What now?" Severus asked, and Dumbledore's answer was a thread he clung to. Protect her son. The vow was renewed, a pact forged in the ashes of what he'd lost. Severus would serve, his life a shield for Harry Potter, a debt paid in shadow and sacrifice. Dumbledore offered him a place at Hogwarts, a professor, a guardian, and Severus took it, his steps heavy as he returned to the castle that had once been his home. The towers rose against the sky, their stones familiar yet distant, and he walked its halls with a quiet resolve, his black robes billowing like a storm cloud. The potions classroom welcomed him back, its air thick with the scent of simmering cauldrons, its walls a comfort amid the chaos of his mind. He stood before the students, his voice sharp, his eyes cold, and taught them with a precision that brooked no failure. The castle's rhythms were a balm, the creak of staircases, the hum of portraits, the soft rustle of leaves beyond the windows, and Severus let them carry him forward, his days a steady pulse of duty and grief. Harry arrived in his first year, a boy with Lily's eyes and James's face, and Severus felt the past rise like a tide. He watched from the shadows, his gaze lingering on the child he'd sworn to protect, his heart a tangle of love and loathing. The marauders were gone. James dead, Sirius imprisoned, Remus a wanderer, but their echo lived in Harry, a reminder of the wounds that never healed. Severus kept his distance, his words cutting when they spoke, his mask a shield against the ache within. The Death Eaters faded into rumor, their mark a faint scar on his arm, but Severus knew they'd return. Dumbledore's trust was a quiet strength, his meetings a rhythm Severus followed, reports of whispers, of stirrings in the dark. He brewed potions for the Order, his skill a quiet asset, and cast spells that guarded the castle's walls. The nights were long, the sky a canopy of stars or a shroud of cloud, and Severus moved through them with a grace born of necessity, his presence a flicker among the shadows. A quiet vigil. The years at Hogwarts stretched on, each one a thread in the tapestry of Severus's life. The castle was his domain now, its corridors a maze he knew by heart, its quiet corners a refuge from the world beyond. He taught with a cold precision, his voice a whip that silenced chatter, his eyes piercing through the students who sat before him. Harry grew, his defiance a mirror to James, his courage a shadow of Lily, and Severus watched, his duty a weight he carried in silence. The potions classroom remained his sanctuary, its rhythms a steady pulse that anchored him. The scent of crushed herbs and simmering brews wrapped around him, a comfort amid the storm of his thoughts. He'd stand over his cauldron, his hands steady, and let the magic flow. Elixirs to heal, draughts to soothe, their colors shifting with a quiet grace. The students whispered of his skill, their fear tinged with awe, and Severus let them, his mask a shield that kept them at bay. Dumbledore's presence was a constant, his office a place of quiet counsel. They'd sit by the fire, the air warm with the scent of lemon drops, and speak of the war that loomed, a war Severus knew would come again. "He will return," Dumbledore said, his voice soft, and Severus nodded, the dark mark a faint hum beneath his sleeve. He'd serve when it did, a double agent once more, his life a bridge between shadow and light. Lily's memory lingered, her face a quiet echo in the castle's halls. He'd see her in Harry's eyes, in the green that pierced through the years, and the ache would rise, a tide he couldn't stem. He buried it beneath his work, letting the potions and spells fill the silence, their rhythm a steady pulse that carried him through the days. The riverbank was a distant dream, its laughter faded, and he told himself it was enough to protect her son, to honor her in shadow. The castle stood firm, its towers a silhouette against the sky, and Severus moved within it, his steps soft, his heart heavy. The world beyond grew restless, whispers of the Dark Lord's return drifting on the wind, and Severus felt the weight of what lay ahead. He'd wear the mask of loyalty, a shield forged in grief and resolve, and walk the path he'd chosen, a path of quiet sacrifice, of duty woven with love. And so Severus Snape's life unfolded in the stillness of Hogwarts, a vigil kept in shadow and silence. The night deepened, the castle's hum a lullaby that cradled him, and he carried on, his presence a whisper in the dark, his heart a flame burning for a light long gone. The final sacrifice, the Dark Lord's return. The air grew heavy with whispers, a quiet unease that seeped into the stones of Hogwarts as the years turned toward darkness. Severus Snape felt it, a shift in the wind, a hum beneath his sleeve where the dark mark stirred once more. Voldemort had returned, his shadow rising from the grave of his defeat, and the wizarding world trembled beneath the weight of his presence. The castle stood as a beacon in the gathering storm, its towers piercing the sky, its halls alive with the soft rustle of students unaware of the tide that loomed. Severus moved through it all with a stillness that belied the chaos within, his black robes trailing like a shadow cast by a fading light. The summons came in the dead of night, a sharp burn that pulled him from the quiet of his chambers. He apparated to a hidden hollow, the air thick with mist and the scent of damp earth, and stood among the Death Eaters once more. Their masks gleamed in the torchlight, their voices a low murmur as Voldemort's red eyes swept over them. He spoke of vengeance, of a world remade in his image, and Severus nodded, his face a mask of loyalty, his heart a tangle of duty and dread. Lucius Malfoy stood beside him, his silver hair catching the light, his trust unshaken, and Severus let it be, his true allegiance buried beneath years of shadow. Dumbledore's office became a sanctuary in those early days, its walls warm with the glow of candlelight and the faint scent of parchment. The old wizard's presence was a steady anchor, his blue eyes piercing through the dark as Severus reported what he'd seen. Voldemort's plans, the gathering of his forces, the whispers of a strike against Harry Potter. "You must remain close," Dumbledore said, his voice soft, and Severus nodded, the weight of his vow settling deeper into his bones. He'd serve as a double agent once more, a bridge between shadow and light. His life a quiet thread woven into the war that stretched before them. The potions classroom remained his refuge, its air thick with the scent of simmering cauldrons and crushed herbs. He taught with a cold precision, his voice cutting through the chatter of students, his eyes sharp as they lingered on Harry, Lily's son, now a boy of 14, his green eyes a mirror to the past. The castle's rhythms were a comfort, the creak of staircases, the hum of portraits, the soft rustle of leaves beyond the windows, and Severus let them carry him through the days, his mask a shield against the storm that brewed. The Triwizard Tournament brought chaos to Hogwarts, its halls alive with the buzz of foreign students and the shadow of something darker. Severus watched from the sidelines, his gaze flickering to Harry, his heart a tangle of love and loathing. The boy's survival of the maze, his tale of Voldemort's return, was a crack in the silence, a truth Severus had known but couldn't voice. Dumbledore's trust grew heavier, his meetings more urgent, and Severus felt the net tighten, his role a quiet vigil in a world slipping into night. The Order and the Shadows. The Order of the Phoenix rose from the ashes of the First War, its members gathering in the dim light of Grimold Place, their voices a chorus of defiance and fear. Severus stood among them, his presence a flicker in the shadows, his words clipped as he shared what he'd learned. Sirius Black's eyes burned with hatred, Remus Lupin's gaze softened with pity, and Severus met them both with a cold stare, his mask a shield against the past they carried. Dumbledore led them, his voice a steady hum, and Severus followed, his potions and spells a quiet asset in their fight. The Death Eaters grew bolder, their raids a stain on the wizarding world. Villages burned, families shattered, the sky streaked with the green of the dark mark. Severus moved between them, his black robes blending into their ranks, his voice steady as he carried out Voldemort's commands. He brewed potions in hidden rooms, their steam rising like ghosts, and cast spells that echoed with the power he'd honed. The Dark Lord's trust was a fragile thing, his red eyes piercing through the masks, and Severus guarded it with care, his every move a step on a razor's edge. Harry grew taller, his defiance sharper, his courage a quiet echo of Lily's light. Severus watched him from the shadows, his lessons a battlefield of words and glares, his heart a tangle of duty and regret. The boy's occlumency lessons were a trial, a window into a mind too open, too reckless, and Severus pushed him hard, his voice a whip that hid the fear beneath. Voldemort's presence lingered in Harry's dreams, a threat Severus couldn't banish, and he reported it to Dumbledore, his words a quiet plea for the boy's safety. The castle stood firm, its walls a shield against the storm, but the shadows crept closer. The Ministry fell, its halls echoing with the footsteps of Death Eaters, and Dumbledore's plans grew urgent, his voice a whisper of what was to come. "You must be ready, Severus," he said, his eyes grave, and Severus nodded, the weight of the future settling into him like a stone. He'd wear the mask, play the part, and carry the burden of a war that stretched beyond the horizon. The Unbreakable Vow. The summer before Harry's 6th year brought a quiet storm to Spinner's End. The house was still, its gray walls a refuge from the chaos beyond, when Narcissa Malfoy arrived, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light, her eyes wide with desperation. Bellatrix Lestrange followed, her voice sharp, her suspicion a blade aimed at Severus's heart. They stood in the small room, the river a dark ribbon beyond the window, and Narcissa spoke of her son Draco, of a task Voldemort had given him, a task to kill Dumbledore. Severus listened, his face a mask, his thoughts a whirl of shadow and resolve. Narcissa's plea was a thread he couldn't ignore, her fear for Draco a mirror to his own for Lily's son, and he made the choice, his voice steady as he offered the unbreakable vow. Bellatrix's wand traced the bond, its magic a hum that bound him, and Severus felt the weight of it settle into his bones. He'd protect Draco, guide him through the shadows, and, if it came to it, take the task upon himself. The vow was a chain, a quiet promise that tied him to the end he couldn't escape. The school year began with a hush, the castle's halls alive with the soft murmur of students. Severus taught as always, his voice cutting through the chatter, his eyes lingering on Draco, whose pale face grew thinner with each passing day. The boy's task was a burden Severus understood too well, its weight a shadow that darkened the dungeons. He watched from the sidelines, his presence a quiet guard, his potions a shield for the plans that unfolded. Dumbledore's health waned, his hand blackened by a curse, his voice softer as he spoke of the end. They met in the astronomy tower, the night sky a canopy of stars, and Dumbledore laid out the truth, a Horcrux, a ring, a death that couldn't be undone. "You must do it, Severus," he said, his eyes piercing through the dark, and Severus nodded, the weight of the request a stone in his chest. He'd kill Dumbledore, take the blame, and carry the secret to his grave, a sacrifice for Harry, for Lily, for a world he'd never truly belonged to. The fall of the tower. The night came swiftly, a storm breaking over Hogwarts as spring turned to summer. Draco stood on the astronomy tower, his wand trembling, his face pale with fear and resolve. Dumbledore faced him, his voice calm, his presence a quiet strength, and Severus watched from the shadows, his heart pounding with the weight of what was to come. The Death Eaters breached the castle, their footsteps a drumbeat in the halls, and Severus moved, his black robes billowing as he climbed the stairs. Draco faltered, his wand lowering, and Dumbledore's eyes met Severus's, a silent plea in their depths. "Severus, please," he murmured, and Severus raised his wand, his voice steady as he spoke the words, "Avada Kedavra." The green light flared, a flash that swallowed the night, and Dumbledore fell, his body tumbling from the tower, a quiet end to a life that had shaped so much. Severus felt the world tilt, the grief a tide he buried beneath the mask, and turned to Draco, his voice sharp as he pulled him away. The castle erupted in chaos, students' cries a soft echo as Severus fled, the Death Eaters at his heels, Harry's voice cut through the noise, his fury a blade aimed at Severus's heart, and they faced each other on the grounds, wands raised, the air thick with rain and rage. "You coward!" Harry shouted, and Severus parried his spells, his face a mask, his heart a tangle of pain and purpose. He didn't strike back, didn't end it, and let the boy live, his duty a shield that held him steady. The night swallowed them as Severus apparated away, the castle fading into shadow behind him. He returned to Voldemort's side, his loyalty a lie woven with care, his role a quiet vigil in a world torn apart. The Dark Lord praised him, his voice a hiss of triumph, and Severus nodded, his mask a shield that hid the truth. He'd killed Dumbledore, taken the blame, and carried the secret. A sacrifice for Harry, for Lily, for a war that stretched into the unknown. The last stand. The final year was a shadow cast long and deep, Hogwarts a fortress under Voldemort's rule. Severus took the headmaster's chair, his black robes a stark contrast to the warmth of Dumbledore's legacy, his voice cold as he governed the castle. The students whispered of his cruelty, their eyes wide with fear, but Severus let them, his mask a shield that kept them safe. Carrows roamed the halls, their wands quick to punish, and Severus tempered their malice, his orders a quiet thread that protected where he could. Harry was gone, a fugitive in a world unraveling, and Severus watched from afar, his potions and spells a lifeline to the order. He sent his Patronus, a silver doe, Lily's echo, to guide the boy, its light a whisper in the dark, and carried on, his presence a flicker among the shadows. The war reached its peak, its echoes a drumbeat in the castle's halls, and Severus felt the end draw near, a tide he couldn't stem. The Battle of Hogwarts came like a storm breaking over the castle, its walls alive with the clash of spells and the cries of the fallen. Severus stood in the headmaster's office, the air thick with dust and smoke, when Voldemort summoned him to the shrieking shack. The Dark Lord's voice was a hiss, his eyes gleaming with suspicion, and Severus faced him, his wand at his side, his heart steady despite the fear. Voldemort spoke of the Elder Wand, of power unclaimed, and raised Nagini, the snake striking with a flash of fangs. Severus fell, the venom of fire in his veins, his breath shallow as the world faded to shadow. Harry was there, his green eyes wide, and Severus reached for him, his voice a whisper as he gave the memories, the truth of his life, his love, his sacrifice. "Look at me," he murmured, and held those eyes, Lily's eyes, as the darkness closed in. The pain ebbed, the world softened, and Severus slipped away, his heart a quiet flame extinguished at last. A farewell in light. The castle stood silent in the aftermath, its towers scarred but unbroken, the dawn spilling golden light across the grounds. Harry carried Severus's memories to the pensieve, the silver threads a window to a life woven with shadow and love. The truth unfolded, his vow to Dumbledore, his protection of Harry, his heart bound to Lily through the years, and the boy understood, his gaze softening with a quiet forgiveness Severus would never see. The river flowed on at Spinner's End, its waters a mirror to a life that had ended in sacrifice. Hogwarts rose anew, its halls alive with the hum of students, its stones a testament to the battles fought and won. Severus Snape's name lingered in whispers, a figure of shadow and light, his story a thread in the tapestry of the wizarding world. The potions classroom stood empty, its cauldrons still, the scent of herbs a faint echo of the man who'd once brewed there. The dark mark faded, its burn a memory, and the castle carried on, its quiet a balm to the wounds of the past. Lily's light lived on in Harry, her son a legacy Severus had guarded with his life. The riverbank rose in memory, her laughter, her eyes, the boy who'd dreamed beside her, and Severus's heart rested there, a quiet peace beyond the shadows. He'd walked a path of sacrifice, his love a flame that burned through the dark, and in the end, it was enough. The castle stood as a sentinel, its towers piercing the sky, and Severus's presence faded into its stones, a whisper carried on the wind. "Sleep now, In the gentle glow of that dawn, the castles hum a lullaby that cradles you. Severus Snape's story is complete, a tale of longing, of loss, of a love that endured beyond the grave. The river flows on, its waters a soft tide that washes away the day, and the world slips into stillness, a quiet farewell to a man who gave everything. Let the light of his sacrifice wrap around you, a tender embrace that carries you into dreams where shadows soften and peace reigns. Rest well in the silence of Hogwarts, where Severus's heart finally found its home.